Jim has really done a tremendous amount of work in Queens on the archaeology and surveying of Queens. He's worked with Bowne House, obviously, and with the Queens Historical Society, and with Queens County Farm. And some of his more recent publications include, and I love this title, Thimbles, Teapots, and Women's Work, The New Domesticity in Early 19th Century Flushing. He's worked quite a bit on the history and archaeology of slavery in Queens. And he's worked on archaeology and architecture, which he'll be addressing today as well. And he's also cross-cultural, worked on some similar topics in Europe in terms of slavery and modern European identity. And one of his areas that he's worked in is Ireland, with Paleolithic objects and Iron Age. Pardon?
Iron Age slavery.
Iron Age. Slavery, that's right. That's right. So please welcome him with me and thank him for being here.
Hi, thank you. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to rethink what I've been doing in Flushing. I hadn't really ever approached it from the Dutch end, except from the very beginning, where I had the questions that when I started at the Bowne House were totally wrong. I actually had the question of what's this English guy doing in this Dutch settlement? And slowly learned that it wasn't really, that it was one of the 5 English towns in the Dutch colony. So this will be a lot of contextualizing what's going on in Flushing, and then we'll end up in Flushing. But it'll take me a second to get there. Now, let's see if that historical archaeology is struggling is actually a new field in a surprising way. That the historical archaeology, the way it's being done today, is something that only goes back to the late 1960s, early 70s, where anthropological problems were being addressed in historical context using the tools of the archaeologist. And so the questions really are of a historical anthropological nature of how do societies come into being, how do they change through time, and in taking that approach to look at the New World, to look at New Netherlands and New Amsterdam, and finally Flushing, has really been an opportunity. And one thing that you start off with the general definition of, it is the archaeology of European expansion and the impact that this expansion has on the Europeans as they change in the New World, as people move from being English to Anglo-American or American. And in New Netherlands, we have a really complicated situation. It's clear that we have the Dutch, that there are the English. Present and often forgotten are the Huguenots. And then at a relatively early date are a fairly large number of captive Africans brought into this part of the New World. Okay. Now, trying to put this in the context of the Dutch Golden Age, of Flushing, and I'll get to Flushing, but part of it is really setting up this context, and I had to kind of rethink, relearn, and reorganize an awful lot of mental lists as I approach this question. As the first thing to look back at the Golden Age, the Dutch Golden Age, is to think about this expansion, and not to make a big deal about it, but one of the reasons that the Dutch were so wealthy at this time was that the Spanish were so lousy in managing their finances. That the Spanish basically took their New World gold and silver and used it as an unlimited credit card and just bought things all over Europe. And one of the things that this spending did is it developed a lot of trade and industries in Northern Europe. And so the Netherlands grows with this Spanish money, with this gold and silver, and with what finally comes a bankruptcy of Spain spending so much that it no longer can pay its bills, and that Antwerp grows, other financial centers grow. The Dutch East India Company is an interesting phenomenon, and again, I have a tendency to not accept the standard way of thinking about these things. But the Low Countries, at this time period, starting in the 1580s and running through from that time on, are in basically a war of independence. It is the Spanish and Catholic forces in the southern part of the Low Countries who are attempting to recapture and bring the Netherlands back in to the Spanish Empire and to the Habsburgs. That there was not a nation state of the Netherlands at this time. When you read the references at this time and you come to the discussions of the 7 united provinces or the 7 provinces, you have a sense of this is a confederation. This is a collection of cities with tremendous desire for independence banding together and not trusting each other, to throw that bit into it. And that these companies end up being a way that they can create a larger entity. The corporation covers the 7 provinces. It's a way for them to put money in and get money out without dealing with the political unification of those provinces. The corporation here, and one of the things that makes us realize is that the Dutch East India Company, with the exception perhaps of United Fruit, we don't think of corporations having their own armies. And the Dutch East India Company, with its ships and with its troops, had a different approach to trade. And one of the things that let's see if I think it's the next slide. Yeah. The Dutch East India Company is that it does have control of the center. Is there a laser here? Very good. Batavia, with hooks to the Spice Islands, really is the trade center for the East India Company. And all of the blue lines then represent subsidiary trade that develops out of Batavia being the central location for the Dutch East India Company. And the point being, the Dutch East India Company is horribly successful. It produces a great deal of wealth, and it pays for the United Provinces' activities, and it leads to a bubble. It brings in a great deal of money into the people that invest in the East India Company. And so we're generally aware of this one. Let's see. The West India Company should not be confused at all with the East India Company. The history of the West India Company, it's not set up until 1621. It's actually underfunded. It doesn't have funds until 1623. It doesn't get the right to operate an army in the initial phases. And there are arguments that it actually was part of the economic and financial aspects of the company were designed to undercut the Spanish. One of the biggest early financial successes, their first payment of real dividends to the shareholders, was 1628 seizure of the Spanish gold fleet. And that paid off well. But again, it's not what we think of as your standard activity for a corporation for trade at this time, of basically operating as corporate pirates. There are a number of small settlements that are set up, and it runs all the way from our local beloved New Amsterdam and New Netherlands. We go up the Hudson a bit. The rest of these settlements are small trading locales. They're not attempts to establish population. The West India Company is there to trade items and to use local indigenous populations to produce and deliver the items. When you think of the fur trade, the success that it did have in New Amsterdam, in New Netherlands, was up in Albany with the fur trade. In 1630, there's actually a proposal, I didn't put it in, of the West India Company seal for the New Netherlands was actually two, I love the phrase, rampant beavers that were standing holding a seal. And it was clearly the fur trade that was the center here. And again, it was not sending out trappers. It was dealing with indigenous people to go get the furs, to trade them, to ship them back, and that the West India Company controlled the trade to the Netherlands. And then, to carry it further, the pelts were transported to Russia. The great coats, Russian great coats are produced. They wear out. The Dutch buy back the coats. You take the long fur that's worn off, the guard hairs that have worn off, and you make felt out of these old beat-up coats. And from that felt, you make all the fine hats that are the rage of this time period, that are sold and worn in the Low Countries and England and all over Europe as very expensive, high-status items. So that the fur trade is very weird when you think about it as a way of not wearing a cap, as a way that you're producing hats to mark the social status. That New Holland here is set up to hook into the sugar trade. That over in Angola, we're looking at settlements that are established for both gold and slaves. And so it's a movement of slaves over to Brazil, from Brazil producing sugar, sugar being shipped up. It's again, the labor that's moved from here, but then the commodities that are moved up, and sugar being the rage. There's some Dutch activity in the Caribbean, which is also related to trade in slaves and trade in sugar, and not a large settlement of Dutch. Now, one of the reasons, and it's not too surprising, is in this time period of the 1630s through the 1660s, in the Golden Age, who in their right mind wants to leave Amsterdam or the Low Provinces when you're in, the center of the world at that time? To leave there and to go to New Amsterdam, Curaçao, New Holland, and to live as a colonial is not attractive. And in fact, by the 1630s, there's a recognition in the West Indies Company that they're not ever going to have large population movements. So that one thing to point out, in just the contrast of New Amsterdam and Massachusetts Bay. After 20 years in Mass Bay, there's a population of 40,000. After 20 years in New Amsterdam, there's a population of 3,000. Okay, and if I back it up just 2 years earlier, or a few years earlier, it's a lot less. It is a trading company. It goes bankrupt, or close to bankrupt. It doesn't declare bankruptcy, but it runs out of cash in the 1630s. It slowly loses colonies. New Holland is lost to the Portuguese. Several other locations on the African coast are lost, and there's this shrinkage of the company. When it finally disappears, the first West India Company just disappears in 1675. So that the first point in terms of establishing context is New York's not part of the East India Company. We're part of the West India Company that was never really successful. Now, okay, here I have the establishment of the colonies, and the commodities produced, the dates that it runs through, and finally the decline here of the West India Company. Whoops, not there yet. New Holland, Recife, is the one locale, part of a treaty settlement that goes on in 1654. The New Netherlands loss runs over a period of time, but is finalized by 1674, and then the bankruptcy. Okay, not so. Change of scale, bring it down a little bit more local. The issue of populating New Amsterdam and the surrounding areas. As I said, it was not an area that drew many Dutch settlers. One of the things that we've all heard of and know about New Sweden on the Delaware, one of the things that I was surprised to find was that one of the driving forces in the settlement of New Sweden held a patroon ship up the Hudson. And he basically gave up hope that New Netherlands would ever turn a profit or attract a population, and started backing a settlement in the Delaware River Valley instead. That the warfare that takes place, and again, the dependence on the local populations creates a situation where up near Albany, it's a different story. And I really want to emphasize that. Albany is much more successful than New York, as much as that hurts our pride today. That we have to kind of remember that. That 1640, 1645, there's a series of wars that take place, conflict better between the Dutch settlers and the River Indians in the area of New Amsterdam. Governor Keith is several cases seems to provoke conflict with the natives in an attempt to clean them out. But in 1643, there is a larger scale uprising. And what's very interesting is that the result of this uprising, by 1645, things have settled down. The Dutch, through various means, have become dominant. The natives have really lost. But at the end of that war, in the end of that conflict, most of the settlement in today's Brooklyn by the Dutch has been abandoned. Much of the settlement along Newtown Creek and into Queens is abandoned. The one case where someone stayed put, our favorite of Anne Hutchinson, who is from Boston, Mass Bay, we all remember that, but ends up in Westchester after being driven out, going to Rhode Island, finding out that even in Rhode Island there are limits to tolerance, and goes up to Westchester towards where the Hutchinson Parkway is located today. In 1642, her house and farm and associated settlement with the other area, folks in the area, are raided. She's killed as a result of this battle, and one daughter is kept as kidnapped of that. So that if you stayed away from the city, it didn't work out very well. That there's a massive bit of people in Manhattan actually leave and abandon the settlement in Manhattan, so that by 1645, one estimate, it might be a bit low, but it still is probably in the ballpark, but it's less than 100 households in Manhattan, and not many other households in Jersey or on Long Island. So that if that's taken as a low point, I want to then look at the growth of New Netherlands, of New Amsterdam, and the surrounding areas. And one of the things that comes to the fore is 1645 through 1650, the English towns are established, okay, otherwise known as Queens. Okay, the Newtown, Flushing, Hampstead, Jamaica, are all settled in this time period. And they're all settled by charters from the Dutch West India Company with English settlers. Okay, so there's a big bump in population that's taking place. There's a number of households that sign the Flushing Charter and move into Flushing. One of those bits that are occasionally mentioned, but put in this context, sort of makes a slightly different point, is with the treaty that takes place in 1654. In Curacao, there was a Jewish synagogue that under the Dutch was doing fine, but had fled there to escape the Inquisition, and was very nervous about the Portuguese taking over Curacao, and left rather than find out what was going to happen. So that we have in the area just north of Wall Street a Jewish population moving into the city at that time. So we have English, and who knows where this Jewish population originally comes from in Europe, as to whether they're coming out of Antwerp or coming out of the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, as things went south for the Dutch West India Company, one of the trade items that it was left with was that in Ghana, it had a monopoly on the trade of slaves. In 1658, it actually traded somewhere in the order of 24,000 Africans were taken from that location into slavery and taken to the other side of the Atlantic. In 1659, Stuyvesant throws in with the slave policy, and a slave ship does show up in New Amsterdam with 300 captive Africans as its cargo. So there are actually probably more captive Africans than Jews that show up at this time period. It's reported that that one ship's population, when it disembarked, added 10% to the population of Manhattan. So again, we're talking about a few thousand people in Manhattan, or Manhattan Island at that time. 1 year later, we have a record of the first Huguenots showing up in Flushing. Again, a dissident Protestant group that were driven out of northern France and the Low Countries, and the settlement in Flushing. And there is a reason that New Rochelle is called New Rochelle. With the abandonment of Rochelle in France, the Huguenots fled and came to this area. And so the population of this region and in the Golden Age is incredibly diverse. There are probably, what do we talk about, a minority majority? That it would have been nothing new at this time. One final bit to throw on this is that the ruling board, the way that West Indies, the West India Company was run, was a great deal of autonomy was given to the local settlement. And there was a board of 8. The number changes over time. So there's a board of 7, there's a board of 8. But in this board, it is not purely a Dutch membership in the board. We'll get to one case of when I was a pup and excavated a site in New England, in Kingston, Massachusetts. It was the Isaac Allerton house. It was a site that was with the dispersal of people from Plymouth. Allerton, who was a member of the company and not a separatist, moved out to this locale. And we had a great time excavating it, as Jim Dietz ran the excavation. And we knew that he moved out there 1629. He left sometime in the 1630s, probably. There's a long wall that probably dates to the time of the Pequot War tensions, 1637. Allerton shows up as a member of the Board of the 8 in the 1640s in New Amsterdam. Okay, so running the colony doesn't even stick with the Dutch. It's not that they're staying in power. They're in pretty desperate straits. Okay. I have one character that I want to run through who is, if you've ever seen the film Zelig, Woody Allen's old film of the one character that shows up in every historic event, John Underhill, Captain Underhill, is the Zelig of the 17th century. Okay. That I've never found a record of him being in Virginia, but in almost every other thing, he's there. And to use his life, a bit of biography, to again kind of bring the context down to a level of, and he does pass through New Amsterdam and Flushing, and kind of reveals something about the nature of life in Flushing in this period of Dutch Golden Age. That Underhill is an Englishman. He may have been born in England in 1598, or he may have been born in the Low Countries in 1601. There's a couple different records of what happened. His parents were both English. His father made the mistake of siding with the wrong guy in a plot against Elizabeth, and so it wasn't a voluntary residence in the Low Countries. It was a flight to avoid pretty certain death. His father died in 1607, and there's a record of Underhill associating with the separatists that were in the Low Countries at the time. Again, a reminder that our wonderful Plymouth Pilgrims actually spent a period of time in the Low Countries before they moved off to the New World. That was in Leiden. I don't know if he was in Leiden. I came across one reference that I don't really totally believe, but hey, people write all kinds of histories, that does put Underhill as an associate for a while with Miles Standish in the Dutch military. That Underhill does associating with the separatists, but does end up going into the Dutch military, being trained with Dutch military procedures, marries a Dutch woman in 1628, Helena de Hoek, I think that would be. They have 3 children. Odds are, I'm not certain, but if you marry a Dutch woman and you're living in the Low Provinces, you probably do speak Dutch. That he has moved in that direction. In 1630, he does become a passenger on the way to Massachusetts Bay. He is brought along as what is the equivalent of Miles Standish. He is the military guy for the Mass Bay settlers who know nothing about muskets, who know nothing about military strategy and techniques. As a matter of fact, it's part of one of the earliest laws that people have to meet with him once a month to be drilled, to be trained. So he does go to Boston, Mass Bay. He is relatively successful in Massachusetts Bay. There's no record I could find that he actually joins a church and gets full citizenship, since you had to be a church member to really vote in town meetings and that sort of thing. But there are other things that indicate that he's sympathetic and does attend some churches, some services. In 1637, he becomes the leader of the Mass Bay contingent down to Lyme, Connecticut, Mystic River. There's another band of troops that are coming from Connecticut, and together in 1637, they wipe out the Pequots in a book that Underhill publishes describing the events. There's an estimate that they killed 400 to 500 Pequot. The remaining, some individuals did escape. Women and children and some men were taken captive, and in spite of all the statements that the term slave didn't exist or the category didn't exist, these natives were sold to Caribbean islands to work on the plantations in the Caribbean and sometime after 1637, so that they're aware of slavery. Again, a hero comes back and becomes an associate of Anne Hutchinson, is on the wrong side of the antinomianism debate, loses, is banished, and returns to England. At the time that Hutchinson flees to Rhode Island, Underhill goes to England to publish his account of the Pequot War. Okay, so that is before it gets interesting. Okay. Within a few years, he returns. He's not really welcome in Mass Bay any longer. He's not really welcome in Rhode Island. He tried that for a while. He moves to Stamford. So he's just up, I-91 there, I-95. That he ends up probably being a neighbor, an associate of Anne Hutchinson, who is in that neck of the woods. The boundaries here of Westchester versus Stamford are not that sharp, but is in that area. This is the period, to bring it forward, of the native unrest and the warfare, the collapse. And there is a record at this time, in 1643, of the Dutch being able, when they mustered, to produce something on the order of 80 muskets. Their entire defense of the whole New Amsterdam rested on a population of 80. And what seems to be the case is that Underhill is approached, an offer is made. There's, in some cases, a number of 50 men that he has hired as a mercenary to come down to work for the defense of New Amsterdam. He leads an attack up Pound Ridge, if you know where that neck of the woods is. It's one location of an attack on the Wapentake Confederation. This is a group of Indians that are named after the location. Again, there's a report of around 400 to 500 natives killed in this attack. It's a winter village. They're aggregated into a large settlement, and he attacks at a point where there's little chance to flee. A few months later, according to one account, in 1644, there's the attack on Long Island at Fort Neck in Massapequa, where 120 natives are killed. He is named to the Board of 8 in 1645. So he's promoted to one of the upper leadership positions at this time. Now, strangely enough, I think, 1645 is the time of the Flushing Charter. And he is on the Board of 8 when it comes to pass that there's an odd bit about listening, the Dutch name. And one of the things you learn, that I've learned, is that in England at this time, they didn't say listening, they said flushing. That the English term flushing as for 400 years applied to this listening port city. Now, in these folks' memory, one of the famous bits that everybody would know about listening is that it's a ransom city. That in jump back a little bit, in 1586, the Dutch rebels needed troops, needed mercenaries to fight the Spanish Habsburgs, who were relatively successful in the southern part of the Low Countries and marching through and capturing town after town, and even capturing Antwerp at one point. So, needing troops, they acquired 7,000 British mercenaries at this time at a charge of £125,000 per year. Okay, but what's the credit? What's the collateral for this loan? Listening. the town is given to the English to control and to run for somewhere on to 30 years. So people would be aware that this is the town that was given for the mercenaries. I suggest, I can't find, no one at the time ever writes that there's this horrible pun going on, that we're going to name this new town that's chartered in 1645 in a way that reminds us of these earlier mercenaries. But I do want to point out there's a fair probability that the settlers of Flushing in 1645, the English settlers, are the mercenaries that are coming out of these wars. People have tried to figure out how this group of people comes together. They're not members of a single church. It's not the story of New England where a church gets to a certain size and it fissions and you go and you move a whole church into a new settlement. This is a bunch of guys. Some are from Plymouth, some are from Mass Bay, some are from Connecticut. It's not clear what holds them together until they appear with their signatures on the charter in 1645. Underhill's not on the charter. He's in New Amsterdam at this time. But that's not true for long. By 1648, he is elected. There's two different versions of the history, at least. One is that he was appointed sheriff. But in fact, there's another account where the laws were changed and the folks in Flushing were allowed to elect their own sheriff. And both of these accounts are for 1648. In any case, Underhill becomes the sheriff in Flushing in 1648 and moves to Flushing around that time. We don't know when he really moves in. He becomes a magistrate, a judge, in Flushing in 1651 through 1653. And then there is this first remonstrance that people don't really know of. The Flushing remonstrance that we all know of is the later one, is the second remonstrance. The first remonstrance is a complaint, and it may have been about the attempt to appoint a sheriff and an attempt to appoint a magistrate, was a complaint that the language of the original charter was not being followed, that they, as settlers, would be given all of the normal rights of Dutchmen in the Low Countries and would be allowed to elect their own government. So what I'm going to point to here is we have this incredibly diverse population and a bunch of feisty guys in constant tension in Flushing and in the Five Towns, Queens area. This remonstrance comes into play. Underhill becomes a leader, going from a sheriff to a magistrate to a rebel. By 1653, he is appointed a commander-in-chief in Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, he is given a ship, and he becomes a pirate on the Long Island Sound. And it's a very pointed piracy that he is to take Dutch ships. In this same period, he goes up the Connecticut River. I don't know. I imagine that since you can sail up to Hartford, that he actually does take his ship up to Hartford and raids the Dutch settlement at what we know as Hartford, the House of Hope, which was a trading outpost and part of the Dutch attempt to control the beaver trade. This, I think, is the point where the English take control of the Connecticut, and this is where the modern interstate system destroys our sense of geography in some ways. That to get up to the beaver trade outposts upstate to New York, up in to the north, we all think of the Hudson River as being the one way. But what we tend to forget is that the Connecticut River, out there, let's see, Greenpoint, right, is on the, Greenport, excuse me. Greenport is opposite the mouth of the Hudson River. So if you go out island there, you go up the river, you go to Hartford, you go to Springfield, you get up to Deerfield, you take a left on the Deerfield River, and the Deerfield River will take you up to the Taconic, and at that point, you're about a 30-mile portage to the Hudson. It is the other way to the fur trade. And this is the English attempt to take that away from the Dutch, this war. I'd even make the case that the Pequot War was also part of that attempt to control the Connecticut. But again, we're looking at this 53, it's a few years earlier. Peace returns, 1654, and Underhill's Dutch wife does die at this point. She's been, this poor woman, who's been, I mean, if she went with him every place, that traveled a good distance. Now, he marries within months. And he marries Elizabeth Feek. Okay, now, this name will come up again shortly. Elizabeth Feek is the sister of Hannah Feek, who marries John Bowne. So that actually Underhill ends up as John Bowne's brother-in-law after all of this. Okay? And just one other bit of Elizabeth and Hannah's mother was the wife of John Winthrop's son, of the Mass Bay governor. He dies when the ship pulls up to the harbor. Some people think he commits suicide. Oh no, Boston. That she then goes through a sequence of marriages and does have these two daughters that are there. Okay, I'm getting there. Someday I'll get to the Bowne house. Okay, I just want to point out the continued resistance. We've had the first remonstrance in 1653. In 1655, according to the charter, the way that it's a company town, right? For the first 10 years, they waived the payment of the tithe. That everybody who's a signature who got property from the company had to turn over a tenth of their production. And they say, the first 10 years, we'll let you get started. 1655, the first tithe is due, and Flushing goes, you gotta be kidding. They refuse to pay. That town meetings are forbidden at this point. The charter is still in place, but town meetings are forbidden. 2 years later, we have the Flushing Remonstrance, a signature that a document protesting the suppression of Quakers in the town and Quaker meetings in the town. The Flushing Remonstrance is well celebrated and for good reason, but we need to remember that it is suppressed. The guys who signed the remonstrance did not win religious freedom. What they got was a ticket out of town. Okay, they were jailed, fined, banished, and were only slowly allowed to. Some were kicked out, some were settled in, but the religious freedom was not won with the remonstrance. In 1658, as part of the punishment for the remonstrance being taken into New Amsterdam and presented to Stuyvesant, that the town charter was annulled. All the rights that they had of normal Dutchmen are now not to be found anywhere in any of the documents. Okay, sometime around, we know that, it's hard to say, Bowne never in his diary says, oh, by the way, I'm now a friend, I'm now a Quaker. But in 1661, he writes a letter, I'll return to it. The letter is written from Newport, and it's very likely that he is at the Newport meeting when he's writing the letter. By 1661, Bowne is, or Hannah for sure, is clearly a Quaker. Bowne is probably a Quaker. He is seized in 1662, taken to New Amsterdam, and is given every opportunity to escape. They leave open the door. They let him go out to walk around. They do everything to get him to leave. And he refuses. He finally writes a letter, 1662, to Hannah, right? And he is then, before he expects, is just banished. He is put on the first ship out. He's not sent back to New Amsterdam, or to Amsterdam. He's not sent back to anywhere. He is just put on a ship and told to leave. And the ship actually leaves him off in Ireland. And with much effort, I mean, if he wanted to go free, he could have been free. He made his way to Amsterdam to argue in front of the Dutch West India Company board to argue for his religious freedom. They go with him, but basically it's an economic decision of we need as many settlers as we can get, open the doors. He comes back in 1663-64 by way of Barbados. Okay, he actually, standard, because of the currents and the winds, standard route, goes to Barbados, actually returns to New Amsterdam from Barbados on a ship with a guy, an Englishman, who is sussing out the Caribbean trade. This guy is a captain, and he lives in what today would be New London, in that area, and is about to move into the Caribbean trade of providing staples to Barbados and to get a slice of the profits that they're making off the sugar there. Okay, back and forth. Okay, I skipped a step here. I wanted to just quickly. Corporal John Scott, Corporal? Yeah, John Scott. In 1662-63, there's plans for a revolt on Long Island. Rhode Island will rise up and join Connecticut. Not the first time, but or the last time rather. Before that plan can be put into effect, the English ship comes into the harbor. The English ships come into the harbor in New Amsterdam. And again, I'll remind you, the reason that there is no fight, that they drop the flag and surrender, is an assessment that the fortifications for New Amsterdam are in such disrepair that the fort is falling apart. There is no way that they can defend the settlement. I only bring that up to sort of as an indication of this is not the golden age in New Amsterdam, that it's not a successful colony at this time, that they're not able to build the fortifications. What often gets forgotten is in 1673, the Dutch fleet sails back into the harbor and takes control for a year. And finally, a treaty settles this, that 1674, New Amsterdam becomes New York, and the English crown gives it to the Duke of York, later to be James, and is set up as a copy of Yorkshire in many ways. There's the north, east, and west ridings as the three parts of it. Okay, back to John Bowne. I'll get there to the house, I promise. Okay. John Bowne his mother dies in 1647 in Derbyshire, in Lime Tree, up in the mid-country, up there. His father very likely is not a person that wants to hang around. There's some indications that he may have been involved in some political activities, and getting out of England would not be a bad idea. He and Bowne and his father immigrate to Boston in 1649. We have an indentured contract that names Bowne providing labor and getting some wine and some money and some clothes out of this labor. He, in 1649, with his brother-in-law, Farrington marries Bowne's sister, Dorothy. Bowne and Thomas Farrington visit Flushing. Now, the thing to note is that Thomas Farrington's brother is one of the signers of the charter. So that this, Bowne goes back to England, 1650, comes back to Boston, 1651, moves to Flushing in 1652, marries Hannah Feek, there she is, in 1656, travels to the Newport meeting. This is important. The date of 1661 for the Bowne House comes from his attendance of the Newport meeting and writing a letter that he will return home. And everybody going, he must have a house if he's going home. So it's pretty poor date for a house, but we know that it's in place. Okay, he sees, returns to Barbados, okay, that puts him in contact with this idea of the developing trade with the Caribbean. One fact to throw out, to put this in context, the invention of white sugar is 1645. There's plenty of sugar before that, but it tastes like slightly molasses. It's not a pure sweetness. White sugar, when they discovered claying, a way of refining sugar, is something that takes place in Barbados and is kept a secret. And white sugar as sweetness is something that people pay for. And is really, this is what kicks off the sugar trade at that time. So that 1645, that this is all, he's aware that there's a lot of people importing a lot of slaves and exporting a lot of sugar out of Barbados at this time. Okay, now, back, well, let me jump up. I hope it's the next slide. Okay, I'll get back to that one. Okay, I've taken a lot of time to convince you of one point, but I really wanted to convince you of this point, is Flushing is not a Dutch town. It's, in terms of the political control, up through 1664, yes, it's under Dutch control. But in terms of the population, it is largely in English, bit Huguenot. There's a few Dutch running around as well, but it is not a Dutch town. The majority of the population is very likely folks from New England, and sort of, you know, maybe came from England to New England, maybe their parents came from England to New England, but most of the folks are coming out of New England. The architecture in New England, in spite of the phrase Anglo-Dutch, it doesn't really appear that way architecturally in England. There's a huge variety of house construction that take place. A dominant form of the houses that still exist in New England have this box frame. And I know it's too small, but there's the sill is put on a rubble foundation. You dig a trench, you fill the trench with rocks. You put the sill on those rocks, level it, you put the posts in the corners, you put the plate in to tie the posts together, and then you put in the joists up on the top. And right in the connection to the chimney that's coming out there, you have a beam that supports the chimney, and you have the summer beams that cut across and support that room. Now, the size is about 16 by 16. It is a box, it is square. There's a great deal of variation off of this theme. As a matter of fact, I mentioned the Isaac Allerton House. One of the things that was the most striking bit of that excavation is that the Allerton House was the first earth-fast house discovered in New England. An earth-fast house is you don't dig a trench, you don't put in the rubble foundations, and you don't put in sills. You put the posts straight into the ground. It's a little bit easier to build. It's really traditional type of form in England. It's not unusual. And people are beginning to wonder if in New England, this is not really the first generation of housing, earth-fast. We find similar types of construction in Virginia, where there are earth-fast houses put into the ground. The interesting thing is that in Virginia, they appear to last a bit longer. We have a better record of them. And one thing I have to admit, I tried to find this out. I've been working on this for a while. The earliest English form house in Flushing, in Queens, is, you go start naming early houses, and I will say Dutch every time you say a house. Bowne House, Dutch. Adrian's, Dutch. Underdone, Dutch. Lot, Dutch. Adrian's, Dutch. You just, Riker, Dutch. Okay, and one of the questions is, and as an archaeologist, if I could just kind of knock down Flushing and excavate the whole town, is whether the earliest occupation actually is an earth-fast construction from these English guys, which would explain their almost total disappearance. Now, the difference in the Dutch house, and this is the framing of the Bowne house, is that it has an anchor bent frame. Now, that I tend to think of, if you look at the end of the house off here on the left, the goal posts that are present there. The posts, they're sitting on a sill. There's a cross beam that goes across, and every succession post has this cross beam, and that's the anchor bent construction. The Dutch house does not have a 16 by 16 framework. You can make it as long as you want. Okay? Now, the other thing that's somewhat different is, again, we think of chimneys as everybody has a chimney, except for maybe guys with horned helmets and beards that use dogs as their napkins. That there you have maybe no chimney, no fireplace. In fact, here we have a hearth, but it's a jambless hearth. The Dutch style tends to have no sides on the fireplace. It's just a hood. It catches the smoke and it goes up. The English, what I showed you with the summer beam, has a fireplace, has sides to the fireplace. It tends to be a massive fireplace. But one of the things that the Allerton site with the earth-fast house and various other places, where we're discovering the variation of people from different parts of England, when they come over here, build variations of the houses, so that the Lincolnshire houses are different than the other shire houses that are built. That what we discover is at the Allerton house, there was no fireplace, there may have been no chimney. There was a hearth, just stones on the ground, the fires were put in there. There's a fair chance that there was simply a hole in the roof that acted as the escape for the chimney. In Virginia, what we discover is the houses are built, they're square framed, the fireplaces are tacked onto the outside of the building and are separate entities. And if you have, and again, it's they're not stone, they're not brick. Very often they're wattle and daub chimneys. If you have a chimney fire, the sticks inside the clay actually catch fire. You can burn down your whole house. And it's been suggested that they simply started with chimneys that could be pulled down if there was ever a chimney fire. And we, again, the Bowne house with its hood, there's evidence if you go and visit the Bowne house. And when's the tour? I'll make a pitch for
March 5th.
March 5th, there is a tour of the Bowne house. You should jump on it. Not many people get inside these days. So that it's a chance to see the results of recent architectural study of the Bowne house and both the architectural history, but also this early Dutch component of it is very obvious in terms of the way that the Bowne house is laid out and the way that it expands. Okay, the most Dutch thing about John Bowne is the John Bowne house. Okay, let me just throw it back to here. In a 1660, I put 1661, it should be 1662. In the letter in John Bowne's jailhouse letter, okay, where he's writing from New Amsterdam, and he writes to Hannah, he makes a reference to a tobacco shed. He also makes a reference that they don't yet have a barn. So that in terms of what people's interests are, at this time, 1661, is the tobacco bubble isn't burst yet. Tobacco is a way to profit. It's a way to pay bills. It is, for a period of time, a legal tender. When Bowne is in Amsterdam and he hires, better yet, contracts an indentured servant, a Clements, he promises to pay him in tobacco after his duty has been completed. So that these white ball clay pipes are from the Bowne house. There are plenty of pipes there. And he actually engaged in growing tobacco, as we can tell from that bit. And there's one other reference there that, again, we tend to think of people staying put and travel being difficult and context being excessively local. One of the things in this letter that he refers to, and he reminds Hannah of the horse that they have on Shelter Island. Okay, so on the other end of Long Island, John Bowne had a horse. How, who, why is not in the letter. But he has a lot of connections. People do travel. And it's part of what we need to keep in mind when we think about this period. Okay. Now talk about the excavations at the Bowne house and sort of give you a little bit of the archaeology. One of the most, in 5 or 6 years of excavation at the Bowne house, short periods of excavation, but spread out over a period of time. In 2000, in the summer there, we were fortunate enough on the north side of the house to discover what no one had a clue existed. Underneath the surface of the grass, in an inch or two, several inches below the topsoil, was a huge limestone slab. We did not pick the slab up, but we excavated around it, found a little hole that allowed us to peer in, and what we found was the well for the Bowne house. This goes down, as you can see the reflection down there from the flash. It goes down to water table. That it's a 9-meter deep, dry stone well. And I have to admit, I'd love to be able to go down into the well and see what's in the bottom in terms of the preservation of materials that would be there. It's not unusual to find leather, wood, and other materials down in the bottom of the well, as well. That's the date of this. It appears to be the original water source for the house as a feature that's there. There's cobbled areas. This past year with the building of the new exhibit area and support facilities, people tested the area and expanded this cobbled surface. And so that we came up, this is a meter by a meter, I'm a scientist, that they discovered something that really ran about 10 meters long. It's a very large cobbled area. It may be an inside of an outbuilding. It may be an area in a courtyard to prevent mucking up the soil with livestock kind of compressing and muddying up an area. But there is a feature there. As of yet, it's undated. We don't know if this is 1660s or when. Oops. The other side of the house, on the west side of the house, on the street side, there's another cobbled area that was discovered. It's on the gable end of the house. And yes, there's the white PVC piping is not 17th century piping. It shows you why you call archaeologists before you dig trenches on historic sites. That this was taking water from the roof to a dry well to avoid flooding in the basement. Again, one of the things I was looking at with this was not only this paving, but to look at the foundation, the rubble foundation. This area right here is where it has been proposed that the addition to the north is added on at a later date. When we looked at the foundation stones, there's no break. It appears as if the foundation is laid at one go. And so there's a bit of a tension between the architectural historian's view and what the archaeology at least suggests. Over here, that this is on the east side of the house, and there's a trench that was discovered below the garden. It is an intact archaeological feature. It doesn't seem to have been disturbed since it was originally filled in, and it contained tremendous amount of teeth, animal teeth, horse teeth, cattle teeth, jaw bones, bones that are the waste of butchering. This seems to be a butchering area, but why it's straight-edged is there's a very straight line, and it's not in alignment with the house. It may be that here is one of those outbuildings that we've never found with the Bowne house. Now, originally we wouldn't look here because this, called the laundry, is right next to the kitchen, and the kitchen originally was thought to be the original house. But I think we now know, if you went to the Bowne house 20 years ago and were given a tour, they would tell you that there's this mammoth fireplace and that room was the original house. We now know that that is an addition, and a later addition to the house. This is the archaeology that demonstrates that. The reason it's worth doing archaeology, okay? There are two walls that come together here. You can see them. This wall that goes down, you can see how it goes down, is a rubble foundation. This wall is much shallower. So we have two walls that abut. They go to different depths. If you're going to put in one foundation for one structure, you would probably be the same depth. And the thing that's really the kicker is this. In the trench, for the shallow bit, that's the addition, is finished plaster. If you're building a house from scratch, the first thing you do is put in the foundation. There is no way, when you're first building a house, that there's finished plaster around to fall into the rubble trench. So that this is an indication, yeah, that kitchen was a later add-on. Then we went looking. This unintended trouble then led to intentional trouble of looking for more evidence. Underneath the floorboards for this edition were artifacts that came no later than about 1800, which led to a date of the floor being put in around 1800, of the structure being put in around 1800. And the architectural historians are in rough agreement with that date for the kitchen. Point, this kitchen wasn't there when that other trench was put in. There was space for an outbuilding away from the house. There, okay, let's see, one more. Okay, just a nice little Christmas shot there. I thought I'd show you what the Bowne house looks like. That there are a couple of things that are worth noting on this picture and in the laser. This is the area that's the addition. The dormer windows are later additions. There may have been, at least there's one suggestion that the first door is in this area that had been cut up into, from here back over to here, would have been 2 rooms with a partition coming in, that this is a later addition. There's a change in the roof line. All of this, it goes back to this drawing where, again, here's the steep roof, and here's the addition that comes out. In the 1830s, the roof is finally raised, and a more English appearance is developed. And right down to, if you look on the north side, one could argue that there's an attempt to develop symmetry. In the 19th century, not that this house would ever be a Georgian house, but to start to develop a central door, a central hall when you enter from the north side, with rooms to both sides, to make it much more English than this Dutch bit. Now, okay, so here, I think that's it. Yeah, I'm just going to go back to that. end up in winter here. The question. Okay, so what I've done is built a tremendous amount of context for the question. And the question I have is, what is this English guy doing in this Dutch house? Okay, the artifacts that we can go through that I saved you, the blow-by-blow account of the artifacts, are Northern European standard artifacts. They're lead-glazed earthenwares, there's cone slipware, there's both cobalt blue stonewares that's referred to as Westerwald, but it's made across Northern Europe. It's sometimes called German. There's a brown German stoneware, the Rhenish stoneware, but again, that's made all over the place. There are any number of Northern European items, and in all of the material, and I've called in a specialist, someone who really knows Dutch ceramics, they found one piece of Dutch ceramics in all the material that was recovered from the Bowne house. So that I would actually now to turn it around and go back to that historic anthropology, historic question of that in Flushing, I think you can look at it and see that for the period of Dutch control, there is almost I would call an act of resistance to Dutch identities. The fact that here they are in the Dutch colony where they have access to, and easy access to, things that should be Dutch products, it doesn't show up. I think, and again, with that history of all of those, this remonstrance, that resistance, this uprising, that opposition, that we have an indication here of plenty of artifacts that are Northern European, English in many cases, and a very thorough absence of Dutch material from this site. The only thing Dutch about it is the architectural construction. And, dollars to donuts, there's no proof of this. It's total speculation. It's worse than the ransom town idea. But that John Bowne, when he marries, 1656, sometime around there, may have bought a standing house. The craziest idea I have is he actually may have bought it earlier. This may have been originally Underhill's house, where he took it over from the guy that it's not his brother-in-law yet, but the guy that he may have, who fled in 1653. So that it is why he'd ever live in a Dutch house is the main question. Okay, thank you.